My Lords, this amendment, 179, stands in the names of the Noble Lord Patten of Barnes, the Noble and Learned Lord Falconer of Thoroton, the Right Reverend Prelate of the Bishop of St Albans, and myself. I think it says everything that needs to be said in some ways, that the former Governor of Hong Kong and the former Lord Chancellor are two of the signatories to this amendment, which clearly is not just cross-party but has support across both houses. And I know that the Noble Baroness, Lady Williams, who I know has taken a personal interest in this, and I really appreciate the time she took in organising a meeting and being willing to address the issues during a long discussion on the subject. I was really indebted to her. I know that she gets the message of this amendment. It stands after Clause 78 of the Bill, and it concerns British national overseas, i.e. BNO, visa eligibility. The amendment would rationalise the UK's policy by offering courageous young people a Hong Kong lifeboat out of the city. I ought to declare interest as a patron of Kong Watch and as Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong. I warmly welcome the government's creation of the BNO visa, which opened up just over a year ago, allowing those holding BNO status in Hong Kong to come to the UK to live the life of freedom that they were promised would continue after 1997. But as the former Foreign Secretary and leader of the Conservative Party, the Noble Lord Hague, noted in last week's column that he writes for the Times newspaper, the policy has immense benefits, and I quote, "Improvements to this scheme can still be made, in particular by creating equivalent rights for those born after 1997. There are many young people who want to leave Hong Kong," he said, "even though their parents want to stay, and they should be welcome here." The government's commitment to the people of Hong Kong and the unanimous cross-party support that this has received shows that we are a country which doesn't turn its back on the persecuted. However, I've become increasingly concerned at the exclusion of young people born after 1997 who are unable to access this lifeline visa route, even though these are the very people who flooded the streets of Hong Kong and stood up for the freedoms throughout the protests in 2019, when I was part of the international team who monitored the last free elections in Hong Kong. It was an extraordinary thing to see firsthand. My Lords, research published at the end of last year showed that 93% of the defendants in protest-related prosecutions in Hong Kong were under the age of 25. In happier times, I chaired a meeting here in your Lordship's house at which two young Hong Kongers spoke. One was Joshua Wong, one of the most heroic young defenders of Hong Kong's freedoms, and for doing so is now incarcerated in a Hong Kong prison. In 2019, I was able to take to Hong Kong the Westminster Award for Human Rights, Human Life and Human Dignity, which I presented to him. That was after he was refused permission even then to travel to the United Kingdom. The other person at that meeting was Nathan Law, the youngest member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. Having a very long time ago, the Noble Lord Patten might even remember this, but I was the youngest member of the House of Commons briefly in my day. I told Nathan Law, who was the youngest member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, that we babies of the House should stick together. Nathan is now in exile, my Lords, in the United Kingdom, and last week we stood together at an open-air rally in London, focusing on the destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms and other aspects of the erosion of freedoms elsewhere in China. This amendment is an act of solidarity with Joshua and with Nathan. Amendment 179 would provide a way out for people of Hong Kong who need it most. The amendment would at least make young people with a BNO status parent eligible to apply for the visa and start rebuilding their lives in this country. A previous version of the amendment was tabled by the Right Honourable Damian Green in the House of Commons, and it received the backing on the order paper there of 30 senior Conservative backbenchers, including several former Cabinet Ministers, a former Foreign Secretary, the former leader of the Conservative Party, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, as well as support from across the opposition front benches. Charles Moore, Lord Moore of Etchingham, writing in The Spectator in December, was equally supportive and called it logical and just. And he correctly highlighted that such a move would not meaningfully alter the overall number of BNOs expected to arrive, because the children of BNO status holders had already actually been factored into the government estimates to some extent at least. In December, the Minister raised concerns about Damian Green's amendment, saying that it did not contain certain safeguards, such as an age limit and residency. My Lords, we listened to that, and this amendment has inserted conditions which would give access only to those born after 1997 and who are currently resident in Hong Kong or the United Kingdom. But both honourable members from the other place and we here have consistently throughout this process underlined our desire that the government adopts the proposal itself, and I've suggested to the noble Baroness, and I know that she is sympathetic, that a simple immigration rule would be able to achieve this purpose. I appreciate and welcome the outreach and the efforts of the government that they've been putting into finding a way forward with us. And I was pleased to hear that in response to a question that I tabled in January, the government recognised that there is a need, and I quote, "We are sympathetic to the circumstances of children born on or after the 1st of July 1997 with BNO parents, and are considering what more can be done to support this cohort where they wish to build a permanent life in the UK." And the noble Baroness and the noble Lord will realise that in this amendment we've also, as in the amendment moved by the noble and gallant Lord Craig, put a timeline in so that this doesn't disappear into the future by too long a distance. Now, I'm pleased that the government has moved beyond the argument that they were making in the other place, that the existing youth mobility scheme was a viable alternative for these young people. The youth mobility scheme, in its current form, is designed to give young people from a selection of countries an experience of life in our country for up to 2 years before taking that back to their own countries. My Lords, it's not designed for those fleeing tyranny. The youth mobility scheme is a non-renewable visa. It doesn't count towards the 5-year route to resettlement that those on the BNO route possess, and crucially, one must apply via a ballot from Hong Kong, which typically opens in January and July each year, meaning that it's not appropriate for those needing to flee the city immediately. With these young Hong Kongers, we need to provide a meaningful route to settlement. The BNO scheme, if it were opened up to them, would provide that. But I'm sure there are a range of alternatives that the government could explore, and I will look forward to hearing what conclusion the Minister has reached on this matter. Let me come to an end, my Lords. As it is at the moment, many young Hong Kongers are left with the only option of applying for asylum. More than 200 who have unnecessarily applied for asylum have described how they left the city at very short notice and couldn't afford to wait until the Youth Mobility Scheme ballot opened. One example, Stephen, obviously not his real name for reasons the House will understand, is a 19-year-old who fled Hong Kong in November 2020 to claim asylum in the UK. He had a protest-related charge brought against him after his part in a protest and his subsequent arrest in 2019. He was released on bail and was awaiting a date for his court hearing when he fled to the UK, a decision he took suddenly after hearing of friends being arrested and a further charge brought against them. Young people like Stephen have been floundering in our asylum system for over a year and have been unable, therefore, to work, an issue the committee has addressed at earlier stages, living a life on the breadline and in limbo. There's no need for young, talented Hong Kong pro-democracy activists to be treated like this when they have the ready-made BNO scheme as an alternative. And if I can say that as someone who once represented the great city of Liverpool, the debt that city owes to Hong Kongers who have arrived there over the years, some fleeing the Cultural Revolution, some coming from as early as the 19th century. The talents and the gifts that they bring to our country are enormous. What we're asking for here is a small and rational compromise which would help the young people who really need it. I look forward to continuing the conversations with the government to bringing a solution to that end, and I beg to move.
Proposed after clause 78, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
I'll be very brief in supporting that speech in this amendment, not because I don't feel passionately strongly about it, I do, but first of all out of a late evening act of charity to the crowds who were